Good evening, everybody. It's great to be in this wonderful city. So today I'm going to speak about India's rise on the geopolitical stage and which nation is going to be the next superpower. So if we have to understand India's rise, current rise on the geopolitical stage, we have to understand that it is actually India's revival on the geopolitical stage. And to understand that, we have to go back a little bit in history. So if we look at the historical record of India, you go back 5,000 to 6,000 years, then you will find that there was something called the Saraswati Sindhu phase of Indian history, which is also known as the Harappan phase or the Indus Valley phase. And the geographical area of this geography was greater than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia put together. And it was a completely urbanized civilization, a fully industrialized civilization, and extremely scientifically advanced, technologically advanced, the most technologically advanced civilization of that time. And clearly the GDP which was produced by this region was greater than anything else that was produced anywhere in the world. Now, if you look at the economic history of India of the past 2,000 years, you can study the work of Angus Madison, the great economist, and it is very clear that India's GDP was at least 1/3 of the entire world's GDP for about 1,500 years out of the last 2,000 years. So that tells you that India was once the most prosperous and most advanced civilization in the world. Then you have the British colonization. India was occupied by the British. And between the 18th century and 1947, India's GDP fell to about 2% of the world's GDP. And in 1947, India's life expectancy was approximately 32 years. So you can imagine what they did to India. And now India is rising geopolitically and economically. So after 1947, there was a significant period where India's growth stagnated. It was called the Nehruvian rate of growth, 2%, 3%, 4% per year. So India could not achieve its potential for a very long time. Then in 1992, India instituted certain economic reforms. India was forced to do that, and the economy was opened up. And that's when India's growth story started. So it took about 60 years, roughly, for India's GDP to reach $1 trillion. Then it took another 7 years for India's GDP to reach $2 trillion. Then another 7 years to reach $3 trillion. As of today, India's GDP is about $3.5 trillion. India has overtaken lots of countries and is now number 5 in the entire world when it comes to the rankings of the nations by GDP. So that's where India stands today. Now, if India grows at 6% per year, then by 2047, India will have reached 12 or 13 trillion dollars of GDP, which is nearly where China is today, roughly, give or take. And if India grows at 8% per year, then by 2047, India will have surpassed the $20 trillion mark. So India's GDP is the only GDP, India's economy is the only economy that is projected to keep growing in the coming years and decades. Every other economy is currently going into a recession. So if we look at India's geopolitical heft on the global stage, it is largely dependent on the economy and the military might also. So in geopolitics, it's all about your hard power. And hard power depends on economy and military and the kind of relationships you have with other nations. So currently there is one superpower in the world. People like to say that China is also a superpower. So how do we define that superpower? From my perspective, a superpower is a nation that can intervene militarily anywhere in the globe at 60 minutes notice. That is my definition of a superpower. And currently only one nation fits that bill, which is the United States. So the US is the only superpower. And as of today, there are 3 great powers and other powers as well. The 3 great powers today are China, Russia, and India is now emerging as a great power. So why is India emerging as a great power? It's because of the choices that India is making and the foreign policy that India has adopted over the past decade or so. So historically, India's foreign policy was based on idealism. It was based on the non-alignment, and India essentially refused to pursue its own national interests. In the 1950s, India was offered a permanent seat on the UN Security Council 3 times, and India refused that. In the early 1960s, India was offered nuclear weapons technology by President Kennedy of the US, and India, the Indian government, the leadership, rejected that offer. And India saw many such opportunities in the 1950s, 60s, and onwards to become a great power. And India's government refused to unleash the true potential of the nation and help the nation grow at a rapid pace. Understand this. In 1947, Japan was completely destroyed at the end of the Second World War. India was also not in good shape, but India had a functioning government. India was not destroyed by war. And yet, if you look at the trajectories of the two nations, they are very divergent. So Japan was able to grow very fast, and India did not grow to its full potential. So after the 1990s, India's growth started. And after essentially the 2010s, India started pursuing a foreign policy that is aligned with its national interest. So these are the reasons why India is now becoming a relevant global power, a great power on the geopolitical stage, because India is aligning itself with other nations. So India is a member of multiple coalitions, so to say, groupings of nations. There is BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. There is the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which has Russia, China, India, and certain Central Asian nations. There is also the Quad grouping, which is 4 nations, India, the US, Japan, and Australia. So India is playing significant roles in a multitude of important organizations. And India, if you look at the geography, it is a God-gifted geography. India dominates the Indian Ocean region. So geography also tells you how a nation will perform on the geopolitical stage. So India's geography, from one sense, is not very good because it is surrounded by not very friendly nations, but India has the entire Indian Ocean at its disposal. So because of this, India can become a great maritime power, a rimland power from the backender perspective. And we have a prime minister whose policies are very dynamic, and we have a very strong foreign minister, external affairs minister, Dr. Jaishankar, who is effectively putting forth India's perspective on the global stage. So these are the reasons, along with the economic growth, that have propelled India into a position of being a geopolitical great power. And India is projected to rise. Now let's look at future projections. If we have to compare, see, people have been saying that this is the Chinese century. But that's what we've been hearing for the past decade, that the 21st century is going to be the Chinese century. Of late, we are hearing that it's going to be the Asian century. So why has this shift happened? It's because of the demographic problems in China. So the Chinese instituted a one-child policy in the 1970s onwards. And because of that, now the total fertility rate has dropped to 1.1. So for a sustainable population, the state population size, you need 2.1 to be at the TFR. In the case of China, it's 1.1 now. So that population is declining. By 2100, China's population is projected to become around 700 million people. So that's roughly half of what it is today. And as the population declines, it will grow older. So by 2050, China's population, average age of the population is projected to be around 58 years. So the average Chinese person in 2050 will be 58 years old. And correspondingly in India, it's going to be 37 years. So that's a generation's difference. So India is going to have the demographic dividend, but China's demographic dividend has already gone. So China is, if you look at the Chinese economy, it is now not growing the way it was supposed to grow. It's growing at 3%, 4%, maybe 5% per year. And the two engines that were supposed to take China to superpower status, the Belt and Road Initiative and the Maritime Silk Road, are now no longer really functional because the various nations that were participating in this are no longer that interested. And this has to do with the 2019 pandemic that came out of China. So because of this, the Chinese growth engine has stopped. And China is now no longer projected to surpass the US as the world's biggest economy in this century. And now today, if you look at the economic projections, the only nation that is projected to possibly surpass the US in the 21st century is India. So if India gets its act together, it's going to become the Indian century. So there is a huge opportunity for India. There are big problems also because other nations will not want India to rise. We have to understand that geopolitics is it's a cutthroat game, and we already have an established superpower. And when you are a superpower and you have all the power in the world, you are jealous of it and you will jealously guard it. So there is something called the Thucydides trap. It is something that the Greek historian Thucydides wrote about when he, in his account of the Peloponnesian War, which happened 2,500 years ago. So according to this concept, when you have an established power which is threatened by the rise of a new power, then war is inevitable. So right now we have three powers that are now rising. There is India, there is Russia, there is China, and India is the one that seems to have a sustainable rise. So from the perspective of the US, it makes sense for them to try to engineer a fight between these three emergent powers. Let them fight amongst each other so that our power remains safe. So there is the possibility of a Thucydides trap kind of situation emerging in the 21st century. We are seeing very rapid geopolitical changes right now. And as we know, in the BRICS coalition of nations, the weakest link is China. Because China has boundary issues, border issues with almost everybody. It renames the names of places in Arunachal Pradesh, in other parts of India. It also renames the names of places in Russia. The port of Vladivostok, the island of Sakhalin, the peninsula of Sakhalin, all that. So China is a nation that has expansionist ambitions, which makes it the weakest link in the BRICS grouping. So the great existing power, the US, would like to leverage these fissures within BRICS and try to make the coalition non-sustainable. Just like we have SAARC, the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation, which is not functional anymore because of the presence of Pakistan. Similarly, BRICS could become non-viable because of the presence of China. So this is one of the problems that the Chinese would face and the BRICS coalition would face. So right now there is a possibility of the emergence of a multipolar world order, not just one major power, but multiple poles, and possibly a bifurcation of the global system, the economic and financial system also, maybe the emergence of a new currency, maybe a BRICS currency, maybe the Chinese yuan, maybe the Russian ruble, maybe the Indian rupee. So a lot is happening right now and a lot of uncertainty is there. So from India's perspective, if India gets its act together, if India has the right leadership, then India can make this the Indian century. And for that, India will need to ensure that for the next decade at least, if possibly for 2 decades, India should not get embroiled or entangled in any military confrontation with any great power. If India can ensure this, and if India can focus on the economy, then this is guaranteed to be the Indian century. When it comes to the next superpower, right now we have only one superpower, and what can happen most likely is that the 21st century will be a multipolar century. There will not be a single superpower or 2 superpowers. You may have 3 or 4 great powers. The emergence of a new superpower at this stage seems unlikely. Of course, anything can happen. We have seen this happen multiple times in world history. The sudden emergence of a new empire that happens. But as things stand right now, it looks like the 21st century could be the century of multipolarity, multiple great powers and no one superpower. The US is certainly declining right now. Its influence is declining, it's waning, it's moving away from Afghanistan, it's moving away from the Middle East region, from Saudi Arabia, Iran, and other parts of the world. So we are seeing a decline of US power and the growth of India, China, Russia. China is not, its growth is not sustainable. Russia is limited by its population, not by the territory. And India has the demographic dividend. So that is the situation that we are in right now. I personally don't see the emergence of a new superpower anytime soon, but certainly great powers are emerging. India is one of them. And if we play our cards right, that by the end of this century, India will most likely be the largest economy in the world, and possibly by that time, a superpower. So that is how the geopolitical game could go. And I will conclude with that. Thank you very much. Abhijit.